I'm Don Lake, and you're watching For Art's Sake. Hello, I'm Don Lake. I want to show you some work from my watercolor retrospective show here at the Gertz Gallery. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to make this work, and then we'll talk about some of the pieces as we go along. Starting out, when I first arrived at Parkland, I was really not a watercolor painter. It would have been the furthest thing from my mind. But I was teaching basic drawing courses and working on making examples for my students. And I really wanted to expand my teaching range. So I began to explore the idea of adding watercolor to the painting courses I was teaching. And I really had the idea that I could do that fairly simply. And so as I began to explore, and as I was making these drawings, I gradually began to put some watercolor bits and materials that I had into the drawings, only as a color source. And so gradually, to make a long story shorter, that gradually led to a little more involvement with the watercolor itself and a little more interest, and I began to be kind of seduced by the possibilities of that medium. And eventually, I decided to try to make what I would call a real painting, a serious painting with it. And I made a couple of small pieces and eventually ended up making this fire truck picture called Sentinel, along with several other fire truck pictures. And that point kind of marks the beginning of this show, and it kind of marks the beginning of my really lifelong involvement with realist watercolor. After working with the fire trucks for some time, each of these paintings takes a few weeks because I really only had, at that time, 2 or 3 hours in the late night after the kids were down to paint. And so I kind of arrived at a way of painting that was a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And that also kind of resolved for me a bit of a conflict I had with the idea of using photographs as resource material. I really had long thought that was probably not a right thing to do. And I thought that real art should kind of be purely invented, going on memory. But I realized when I worked with some of these first pieces where I was using photographic resources, I realized, wow, this really does change the game. It gives me some new possibilities and some new choices. But still, it was a slow process of bringing myself to an agreement about using photographs as a resource. In any event, these long, slow pictures, even though I only made about 6 of these fire trucks, that was a year's work right there. So it seems as though I was jumping from theme to theme, but in fact, over time, I really wasn't moving quite that quickly. But the next thing, during the time I was working on the fire trucks, I got an opportunity to go out to an airport hangar filled with these World War II vintage airplanes, mostly restored airplanes. And so I shifted my attentions away from the fire trucks onto these great old warbirds. And I made several of those pictures. And then I found a wonderful old popcorn wagon that moved around the streets of Champaign-Urbana, and I painted a little bit of that. And I began to realize, I'm kind of making the same painting over and over again in the sense that I'm painting portraits of these shiny machines. So at that point, I stopped with that, and I shifted back to what's always the foundation for me, which is drawing. And I was particularly interested right then in drawing large-scale pieces with dry pigment and erasers, and the process was what really interested me. And the fact that it was gritty and rough, raw, very direct and physical, really everything that these paintings are not. That really was the attraction in the draw. And so I spent most of that next year just drawing and working with this dry pigment that became a kind of a part of my work and continues to arrive back and forth in my work quite often, partly in conjunction with watercolor now. This drawing is an example of those eraser drawings made with dry pigment and with watercolor. So this really arrives later in my painting career, but it does illustrate the idea. And I'll just tell you briefly how I made this thing. This entire sheet, this is a piece of rolled watercolor paper, very, very large paper. And this sheet was covered with what you kind of see right in here, gray graphite powder, just like you'd use in a pencil, but in powdered form, rubbed into the sheet. So the entire sheet was a kind of a uniform gray. And then I began drawing, but in this case, drawing with an eraser. So basically the end of a number 2 pencil, just could draw, and I would draw, as I always do at the beginning stages of all my work, a kind of a line drawing, or what I call a map of where I'm going to go. And gradually, as the piece evolves, I can erase more and more and more, and then I would paint over the erasures and sometimes add some graphite again and paint again, and so there's a process. But you end up with something like this, and I really like that way of working, and it's a much more physical way of working than when I'm painting the slower, very kind of methodical, layered watercolors. Strictly watercolors. I could also say about this piece something that as my work moved along, as time went along, I began to be interested in industrial imagery. My dad had worked at an oil refinery all of his working life, and so I had a very strong sense of what that place looked like, smelled like, and how it fit into his life and our family's life and my life. And so I found it an interesting thing to think about painting. So I was able to get in there because of his pull. I could get inside, and I made some photographs and was allowed to roam around in there. And I made some early pieces, including the piece called Object of Affection, and there's another piece in the show from that oil refinery called Concentric. So I was thinking about the industrial imagery, and my mentor and great friend, Harold Greger, a professor at Illinois State, we had become friends through the watercolor world. I was not a student of his in college, but he became a wonderful influence in my life. And in any event, he suggested, instead of jumping around from theme to theme to theme, he said, "Don, you should stick on this industry stuff." He said, "Nobody's doing that, and you're really doing it well." And so I took his advice, and I'm glad I did. I spent about the next 15 years working on industry imagery. And one of the first places I was able to visit inside, unlike looking at things from the outside, one of the first buildings I got into was this forging company in North Champaign called the Clifford Jacobs Forging Company. They're still there. I'm not sure under that name, but it's still an operating forge. And so I was able to get in there, and they showed me around, and later I could return there, and I was given carte blanche to wander around on my own. So I saw that and really kind of got completely enamored of this kind of space. It wasn't an entirely new thing to me because I had worked in a big old factory, not quite like this, but I'd worked in a big old factory when I was in grad school, and so I knew about the thunder and the darkness and the chaos of those places, and found that kind of kind of exciting and something I kind of knew about, sort of in my gut. So, but this place opened some great new doors for me. And in fact, after I'd worked there a little bit, the guy introduced me to a man from whom they got their steel in Pennsylvania. So then I was able to visit that steel mill. And it appears in some of these pictures. And that became a kind of pattern that worked great for me. Trying to walk into a place like this with a camera is not likely. And the sense of why would an artist want to come here is also pretty obscure. So you really kind of need an entree. And these guys would always introduce me then to the next factory and the next factory. So it worked out that I could visit lots and lots of places. I even took a sabbatical year to travel everywhere I could east of the Mississippi, visiting as many factories as I could along the way, and not incidentally following the leaves changing all the way up through to Vermont. So I was talking about my experience working in a factory for a couple of years, working nights at the Coleman Company. We made camping gear and camp stoves and also other products, but it looked quite like this place. And this is a place that I was able to visit later in my career when I was still working on the industry series. Radio Flyer, where they make these little red wagons and this is a third generation family operation in North Chicago. And I might point out while we're looking at this picture that when I visited this plant, this was right after 9/11, and the security in places like this had increased extremely, and also the very strong sense of patriotism and America First was everywhere you looked. And so I thought it was interesting to put that detail into this picture. Another thing that I will point out in this picture that's unusual for me is that there are people here. And normally I don't use people in my pictures, but you see them in a few cases, except where they are specifically figure paintings. But I've always felt like when I put people into a picture, it becomes an illustrational thing, where it becomes the story of those people doing what they're doing in the picture. And I would prefer that the space be empty so that you have to insert your own experience there. So you notice that in a few of my pieces. Why aren't there people? That's why. So similar places, kind of gritty places with a whole lot of stuff going on, have always been interesting to me. And although this is in exact chronological order, I did spend quite a bit of time working on construction sites, and that particular painting is a painting of a couple of Parkland buildings were being built, the planetarium and theater. And so I dragged my students over to that construction site regularly, and we made drawings. And so that was one of the few paintings I made of that space, but kind of pertinent to Parkland. Thinking back a little bit to the fascination with machinery and fire trucks and airplanes and so on, when you live in central Illinois, this becomes a kind of ubiquitous character wherever you look. And I had a student who was a farmer, and I got into his machine shed and looked around. And so this particular piece ended up, happily, in the hands of someone who actually drove this exact machine, not this one, but one exactly like it, when he was a younger man. And so I always like to know where my pieces end up. You spend a lot of time and energy, and people might say I'm at love on these things. And so it's important for me to know that they ended up in places where I would like them to be. And I don't always know where they end up. This one I know has a good home. So kind of following on the theme of the fire trucks and the airplanes and the John Deere combine, in recent years I've been working on these Airstream trailer pictures. My wife and I had some property in Kansas where we intended to retire and build a house and studio and retire there, and that process put me into a landscape mode for about 15 years, which we'll talk about. But after that, when it turned out we were not going to do that, we decided, well, how else might we spend our retirement? And we decided, we'll just travel. And I'd always been interested in Airstreams because they're sort of sculptural classics. And so we began to look for an Airstream and decided to buy one and test out the idea of being campers and RV people. Well, it turned out we loved that, and so in the process we've traveled a lot in it to some interesting painting sites. But sometimes we go to rallies where these old Airstream classics are often part of that event. And so I've seen some of these really beautifully restored old trailers and love to paint them. These are quite factual, a bit like the fire trucks were in the sense that the trailer itself, I'm quite reliant on the photographs I make to get it right, because it's important, the way I think of these pictures, it's important to me that they are correct. These people have spent no end of time and money and effort to restore these things, and I want my paintings of them to be right. But I really love the idea of shiny stuff, and this is the epitome of shiny stuff. So as we began our travels in our trailer, we've spent a lot of time in the Southwest, partly for family location reasons, but visited some of these really rugged canyon country, which we've come to really like that, so we repeat that trek often. And it's become a kind of a strong theme in my work over the last 3 or 4 years, the Southwest landscapes, canyon country. So these are just examples of that. A favorite place is the Paladero Canyon in the panhandle of Texas. And that's also an image of Paladero. Very, very rugged, raw, dry environment, and a very huge, deep canyon. This looks vast. Well, it is vast, but when you drive up to it, it's just sort of sudden drop off of about 1,000 feet. So you're thinking in the middle of this flat country, quite a surprise to come upon that canyon. But you can go down in it, camp down in there. You can actually drive down in it, and so we spent a lot of time there. And at other canyons, this one in another spot, Utah, and a place we like very much, Dead Horse Point, and this is a detail of that place. A mile or so hiking back in, you arrive at scenes like this. And other travels have taken us to Canada, and this is Prince Edward Island and the Atlantic Ocean, and Costa Rica, up in the mountain farms and in the rainforest. So I've kind of painted a lot of those kinds of places, new adventures, so interesting to me that I want to make paintings about them. Normally I've made 5 or 6 paintings of those themes, just I'm kind of back to that standard again. Now, one thing about this picture, and several of these that size, the Boundary Waters pictures, those are all just drawn by hand. They're really not photo-driven pieces, although I make photographs. These are pieces that I've kind of invented. So it's a different process of working, and I start out with a pencil and I just draw everything that I can imagine in there, and the piece is kind of finished as a drawing, and then I start to pile watercolor layers on top. And so I have several examples of that where I've done that in these travel pictures, and also in a couple of the industrial images which we can look at. When we were talking about the fire trucks and the airplanes, and I said I kind of moved off into a drawing period, at that time some other things were happening in my life that changed what I was interested in and what I was focused on. We bought a new house, or not a new house, we bought a house that had a swimming pool. And so I was very interested in what I could do with that swimming pool. And so in this show, there are a couple of images of swimmers and my family swimming and jumping and diving in the pool. But at that time, I was gradually getting interested in, more seriously interested in painting landscapes. And so what really interested me about the landscape was out here on the prairie where we live, most of the landscape you see is sky. Your eye level is always at the horizon. A lot of people haven't quite recognized that, but that's always true. If you squat down on the ground, the horizon comes down there. If you go up in an airplane, the horizon goes up there. So I was interested in the idea that we are very small in this very vast landscape, and mostly what we see is the sky. And so I began a whole series of what I call Prairie Sky Pictures, of which this is an example. And I would come each night out to Parkland around dinner time or 6, 7 o'clock in the summer evening, hoping that this night would be a great night for sunsets or something dramatic in the sky. And so, if you look at that picture, you also see a lot of little details, namely the lights that are all over our campus. It's otherwise just an invented landscape because I wasn't really interested in what went on the ground. I mostly made that into a near silhouette, but it was from the horizon up that interested me. In fact, my first big body of landscape pictures were these sky pictures. So I've always been a prairie dweller. I grew up in south central Kansas, and then I moved to Illinois. So the prairie and the big sky and the flat farmlands is kind of my experience. But so when I travel to these other places, I'm very aware of what I know about it and what seems new and different. Why am I interested in this? In fact, that's kind of the way I think about all my work is there's something here, something right now that's interesting me, and I try to think what it is, but I don't always know. It's just something. It may be the light, it may be the nature of this landscape in front of me. I just never know for sure. So I take pictures and I try to make notes and mental notes, and sometimes, most times, those don't come to anything. A painting never happens, but sometimes there's a kind of continuing nag that makes me think I need to pursue this. And so it's often because of things like this place. This place is a dry place where things grow. I get the idea these juniper trees are 1,000 years old. How could it grow there? It looks like an impossible thing. So there's the survival of the fittest quality about some landscapes, in particular those Southwest landscapes that really interest me. And I really like the nature of the plant life, the vegetation out there, not at all like we would see here in this lush farmland of central Illinois. And the other thing is there's a quality of light that is just different in the Southwest. The sky is bluer. I've always heard that the sky in certain places, when I was a student, it was always the sky in Venice is different. And that's why all the painters went there. Well, there's some truth to that. But I've also heard that the sky in New Mexico and Arizona and the Southwest is bluer. And I tell you, I believe it's true. It is. So those things, whatever, it's that part of that something. What is that something? It's a little bit sometimes hard to know. Maybe you sense it. And that's probably what drives me finally to make this picture or ones like it about that place. And there's something quite like that too in the picture of Prince Edward Island there. First of all, we went there because someone said there's a place called the Red Cliffs. And when we got there, I was floored because they are red, seriously red. And then there's the very cold Atlantic blowing in on a strong wind, freezing cold. Something about that set of things welded that moment in my mind. And so I painted a couple of these Atlantic landscapes. There's something about that place. Could not be more different than this. This is a painting of a steel mill in Detroit that illustrates nicely the idea of graphite and watercolor, a process that I use quite a lot and which appears in quite a few of the pictures here. It's one of 2 or 3 central kind of working methods that I use. Basically, the idea here is that this entire picture was first drawn as a pencil drawing, not solid graphite with eraser, which we did talk about before, but in this case, just a pencil drawing, but one which looks a little bit pale so that it never gets very, very dark. And over top of that then, first I scrub over that graphite with water, so that pushes the graphite into the fabric of the paper, so that when I paint over top of that, it won't stir up, lift up, we call that wash up. It won't wash up into my color and make it dirty, which would be a disaster in the case of yellow or very light, delicate violet like this. So I needed to make sure that graphite drawing was anchored well into the paper before I painted, because I knew this was the color scheme I was going for, a kind of complementary scheme. You see these complementary schemes all through my work and other kind of set pieces of color sets, orange, green, and purple as an example. So this is then painted with some layers and more layers and more layers of transparent watercolor over what is actually a graphite drawing underneath. So continuing on the story about the Kansas property, that became so much a matter of heart that it became almost exclusively the subject matter I worked on for the 12 years that we owned that property. And so while in that work, I've done a variety of things. We were only able to visit there because of the academic year when I had breaks, because I was still teaching full time. And so I was there in different seasons. And so one of the things that fostered in my work was starting to paint the various seasons, snow pictures, for an example, that I never had painted before. Never really thought I would ever want to paint those. I was afraid they would have a Christmas card prettiness, kind of a sappiness about them, or saccharine that I avoided. I changed my mind about that once I started looking at it and painting about it in a place that I loved like that. So painting the seasons, and you see that in these pictures. And I painted the same place. This is the low water bridge that you cross to pass into this property, which is a story all its own. Depending on the weather, you may or may not get across whichever side you happen to be on it right now. But it looks very different in different seasons. And another thing that came of those visits was starting to paint more seriously on location. These are very quick little pictures, mostly small, like this size, because that's how much I can work on in that 3-hour period before the light changes. And very direct, where there's no drawing ahead of time, or if there is, it's just the most, like a minute's worth of mapping. So I kind of have an idea where I'm going, and then I just start painting with one big fat brush that prevents me from doing any delicate little things, but allows me to do quite an array of marks. And so I'd actually been teaching this process of on-location painting, but down in the mountain streams of Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains National Park, where I taught down there for 25 years in the summers. But this is an example of that process of direct on-location painting from the Kansas property. So this was the spot in Kansas, the spot I would have to describe it as, because this is the place on a 60-foot high bluff down to this river where I would have built my retirement studio looking out to the north to the hills beyond. It's in the middle of ranching country where there's no one around but a few cows, or maybe quite a few cows. And so it was a heavenly spot to be. Lots and lots of variety and places and things to see and paint. So I particularly treasure these paintings as expressions of that spot in that time in my life. Another thing I talk about occasionally on this is, typically in my paintings you see the spatial device is to move a road, a river, something meandering back into the space. In this case, it's really built of layers, tiers, tiered space, so-called, T-I-E-R. So the river flows across. There's a certain zigzag quality that I use sometimes, and you see it again in that picture. This is actually an Illinois landscape, and in fact, I talked about looking west from Parkland, the art building, the S building, kind of the highest spot I could get, and looking west, when in those days, there was nothing but farmland and sky beyond. So, and in fact, this is a spot where nowadays, if you sit in that spot, you'd see the Dollar General store, and this is all filled up with houses. But a thing I could point out in this picture is you see a lot of white stuff here. The thing about watercolor painting is you don't use white. The white you use is the white of the paper. So you kind of have to work from the beginning with a strategy to preserve that white so you have that white later in the game. Or if you want light yellow, you've got to have white there too, because you need that space for yellow to look yellow. Anyway, sometimes I'm not happy with the amount of white I get or end up with, so I use an electric eraser to grind the color off the page. And this is an example where I did a lot of that. So it's something I talk about once in a while. It's something I use in much more passive ways most of the time, but there's an example of it in a watercolor. This painting is another of the river pictures from Kansas. And I like to point out that this structure is quite like the structure of a fiery steel mill, where you're looking into a white-hot fireball, in this case, the sun. And so it's as a painting strategy, it's quite similar. I like the idea, this photographers would call this a burned out edge, where it's so bright that the camera can't understand that, and so things just vanish. And I like that idea pictorially, and I've used that quite a lot in my pictures, whether it's the sun or whether it's fiery steel. The other thing is that when I got to Kansas, so much of the time I was there in the barren times of the year, in the winter, in the fall and spring, before it was a green, lush, tree-filled space. And so the grasses and the tree limbs and all the textures that you see gradually changed my paintings from fluid washes of big layers of color to much more of what I would consider brush drawing. And I continue to do that even though I'm not painting this stuff anymore. That kind of shift in my manner of working is permanent. So this is really an extreme of that linear character. And I actually thought this had a sort of a stained glass window, like the leading in a window quality about it. So that's why I emphasize that. And just another example of the Kansas here. And that roadway I talked about, moving it into space. Typical in a lot of my pieces, you'll see that device. I frequently like to use arbitrary sets of color, partly just as something that interests me, a kind of another hurdle to make the painting interesting, and also just because I like the unifying quality of a set of colors when instead of what we call local color, realistic color. And so you see here orange, green, and purple clearly stated just as a decision made from really the idea of the warm sunset probably. And here's some more of that burned out light coming through from the back that I mentioned. As a very recent theme, I've been painting fire. I have a friend who has a ranch north of Muhammad, and he has to burn his prairie from time to time. So I've been helping him burn that, and I've made some small pictures of that. And I live in a very wooded area where every day you pick up a lot of sticks, and so we always have a lot of burn pile, and every so often it has to be burned. And I painted those piles of sticks because they have a certain primitive sculptural interest for me. I'm painting some more of them right now. But eventually I have to burn those piles of sticks, and so every time I burn that, I sit and think about, like you do when you sit in front of your fireplace, I wonder if you could paint that flame. It is so hypnotic and so beautiful. So at some point I decided I'm going to give that a go. And I also might point out on this picture is quite large, bigger than most people think watercolors are. 60 by 40. This is on a sheet of paper I bought, and I have hoarded 2 or 3 sheets of this paper for many years. And I realized, you know, Don, time's passing. If you're ever going to paint on those big expensive sheets, you better do it. So I got this sheet out to try that, partly because that fire goes 15 feet in the air or so, and there's something about the scale of it that seems important. So I wanted it to be big. And I also knew I wanted to get very involved in the complexity of all of these sticks and flame living inside the pile of sticks and so on. So that's the story of the fire. When I first began painting watercolor, I thought this was going to be a short-term thing. I thought it was a much simpler world than it is. And so one thing that's happened over the course of the last nearly 50 years now working with this is that I've realized what a sort of vast set of choices and possibilities there is when you have the qualities of the paper, and there are so many kinds of paper that behave in so many ways, and you have the endless variations of what happens when water and color go on to paper that may be wet paper, dry paper, with a big brush or a tiny little brush. And then the variety of subject matters that you're trying to describe. I realize that, you know, 50 years is just a good start. But I do feel very satisfied and very, I don't know if proud is quite the right word, but I feel like watercolor is a much more substantial thing to have spent my life working on than I did 45 or 50 years ago when I began.